G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and a fantastic start to the week, and especially I've put on my nicest suit for you. I've lost a little bit of weight recently and actually fit back into this, so that does feel pretty good. Now we have a lot to go over. I don't know how long this video is going to be. If the number down below starts with a 4, I'm sorry, I apologize, but you're going to be here for the long run or do the maps and leave. But of course, we're going to look at the maps. We're going to look at some footage, some strikes. We need to talk in length about China, what's happened between Xi Jinping in France at the moment and Macron, and what he has actually said. Little bits and pieces are being quoted out, but we're going to talk about what the full thing actually said. And then we need to look at attritional warfare, prolonged warfare, and see how we can apply this to what we're seeing on the front line. And reading through this, I was like, I just want to present all of this to you so you guys can make up your own mind and go, is this exactly what we're seeing on the front line as a strategy to have overall success in this war? Regardless in this war, regardless of which way it goes, which way the border moves, the front line border, the cost of human life is just going to increase, and I fear exponentially over the next 12, 24 months. And we have no idea how long this war is actually going to continue for. And I fear that wherever this then ends, we're going to think, well, we could have had that end 500,000 men ago, wherever it has laid. But we will see. So straight off the bat, I want to talk about this video captioned in my Telegram, of which you should come and join, as the girl that tells you that her friend is not interested. But we see this bloody behemoth of a thing, I'm guessing on a T-72 body. As we know with T-72s, the amount of just hulls of these is just crazy. That's why we see things like the Terminator on a T-72 hull and all these others. But we can see a mine roller at the front here. We can see the gun. The gun will have very little movement right or left, but it'll still have up and down. Of course, we can steer then side to side with brake steer on the tank. But these Blackmobiles, behemoth, whatever you want to call it, turtle tanks, laugh at it all you will. These are being successful on the front line. I'll post some footage up in the Telegram of the movements then into specifically Krasnoyarivka, a place where Russia couldn't break in for months, and many, many, many months. And then these have allowed that break in. Of course, these are jam-packed with sensitive electronic warfare equipment, which by shrapnel can be taken out because it uses a type of antenna radar as well. And as well, just extra protection, setting off shape charges or drones coming in, and guys in here as well we see getting dropped off. So laugh at it. People laughed at the cope cage. Everyone took the piss out of that. Now, bloody every tank, regardless, is running a cope cage. You see the Makavas in Israel, arguably the best tank in the world, with cope cages on them. And the truth is, in this environment, it is working. And at some point, I believe we will see Ukraine with this tactic of building up on tanks at some point in the future, if we see and when we see Ukraine back on the offensive. Same thing with the Dragon's Teeth, the concrete bloody Toblerone looking things of, this won't do shit. Well, we now know Ukraine's putting them all over the country. Now, another thing I just want to correct on yesterday, and that's probably my eyesight more than anything, or just my attention to it, was the strike on the bridge down in Chasiv Yar. So geolocated to right here. So of course, this is Chasiv Yar. The front line is sitting right down here somewhere. I'll actually show you on the map. So if we come down into, this is Avdiivka, come down Chasiv Yar, we're talking right where this gap in the trees is here. This makeshift new bridge that was made to cross troops in to defend over on this Kromove Road of Life. Now, more clear footage has come out. If you remember yesterday, I said that there's two possibilities here. Either that Russia struck this bridge here and took it out, or Ukraine on withdrawal took out the bridge themselves, which makes sense on a tactical withdrawal from an area. Now, what I failed to actually see in this was what was up wasn't part of bridge. It was actually a dump truck full of gravel or something here. So it was actually trying to dump it into here. As you can see, there's been another load or two previously to try and fill this, to try and get across. So what we can presume here was this was a Russian strike, otherwise Ukraine wouldn't take out a bridge that they wanted. We can see then the footage of this then being struck, as well as they strike then this dump truck in here, and the far better footage quality here, we can see clearly that this is actually the truck has been struck there as well, making another problem to try and get this bridge back. But it shows as well the amount of ISR still operating over here by Russia out over non-occupied territory. So that is interesting as well. Now we're going to talk and look at the maps, get an idea of what is going on. And I will say we don't have that many updates today, but someone did send me a CNN article talking about that there are people on Ukrainian bloggers losing some faith in the MOD's reporting, and they're quoting Deep State saying people are going, well, there's geolocated footage of Russian soldiers here, and the map doesn't display it. And that was CNN saying this. Now, of course, here is Ukraine, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22 and the purple since 2014. So now over 10 years. Some areas of which you may want to be familiar with in the coming weeks is Kharkiv, Sumy, Belgorod, Kursk, if we see that north group cross from Russia. But I'm still not convinced. And everyone else is saying it's confirmed, it's confirmed. I'm still not convinced that that is what exactly is going to happen. And we'll talk about that at the end. Anyway. What we want to look at first is actually a little bit of footage up near Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. So we see that this is a power station in here. Now, this has been struck and new footage has come out shared by Russian sources today. So if we come down Sloviansk, we can look in here and we're talking this power plant here. So how far behind the line are we? Now, of course, this is always rough because of my dodgy clicking. Let's go 22 kilometers. So well within, and as we know now that Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, these are within glide bomb range and many other pieces of equipment also. Now, we see the footage here. So you can see, zoom in on power plant area. Very hard to see where that coming, but you can see then where those ponds are. And we can see a strike off to the side here against what looks to be like transformers and electrical equipment, then a strike against, again, I don't bloody know power plants, but it's hard to tell. But any explosions like this will have significant damage in these areas. And we know that Russia, again, is targeting critical electronic infrastructure like this and dual use target to try and limit the production of the electricity. And we know that is important in war. Now, let's come back out so you get an idea of where we are. Donetsk Oblast, and we'll come down where most eyes are at the moment is what I'm calling the Avdiivka front. But to be honest, we're going to have to start calling it another front line as this is moving further and further away. And as this has expanded and ballooned out, it is reducing the possibility for a successful offensive here to just cut this off. Now, this Arkhangelski in here probably butchered that. We have seen withdrawals from here, Ukrainian withdrawals, and this is proving to be more and more costly. These withdrawals, we see a video today of an M113, I won't show you, but very costly in here, as well as that withdrawal on foot, middle of the day, straight line troops out of here getting hit by artillery. And getting ambushed, retreating can be incredibly costly in here. We don't see any change up on this exact front then today, but I wanted to talk about how important that area actually is. But let's have a look here. So we see further expansion out to the south towards, sort of towards Urmansk, I guess, but expanding that control out further there. And then we move down and near Neselove, this open area here, we do have a new advancement just out so Russia has, by this map, said that they've crossed then this creek line and are moving up to the tree line in here, further closing up this. And I think Russia will want to move and consolidate this whole front line of open territory. And this could move quickly through this open territory and fall back into urban centers. As Russia has the advantage in artillery, tanks, and numbers. Open ground is not where Ukraine want to fight. They want to fight in closed terrain currently. Then we see just from the south of Pervomayski, another Russian movement here, just closing up between this gap between Novelsky, Pervomayski. Other maps will show different amount of close up in here, but what Surak has said is Ukraine has re-entered Novelsky on defense in here as well. Now, we don't actually have a Surak map update on this frontline area. Now, nothing in Novomyarivka. Disappointingly, I think, for the credibility of this map, and this is destroying the credibility of this map currently, is this in Krasnoyarivka. That there is geolocated footage of flags being raised, tanks moving in and out in Krasnoyarivka, outside of where even the grey zone is being shown on this map. And I think that is disappointing. And I think the creators of this map need to bloody update it to maintain the credibility and legitimacy of the map. Of course, we know signed deals with the MOD, so Ukraine should know exactly where this is sitting in here. But we do know the control is far more significant than what is being shown here. And this is the area that we're seeing those turtle tanks. Now, another very important, if not the most important, depending on the axis, advancement from Russia, and many are saying people who've watched me as saying somewhere I play down and I shouldn't, is up in Kislivka. So this is up in the northeast on the border of Luhansk and Kharkiv Oblast, that Russia is making some ground out of here. And if we step back through the days, we can see over the past few weeks, if this map will load, this movement through Kislivka. Sorry, my computer's going to be slow. And then forward, and then to what we then see today, making some ground as well. Let's have a look. We're talking, depending on 1.5 Ks to over 1 kilometre of ground, which is significant on any front, showing that the majority of Kislivka now has come under Russian control. This whole frontline area is very, very important and has held and been stagnant for a large amount of time. So movement there, that's not shown today by Surak, but having a Russian advance on the Ukrainian map, we can confirm that it's at least there, if that then makes sense. Now, it might take me a minute to find the next spot because it's not somewhere we talk about a lot, but we can see on the border between Luhansk and then Kharkiv Oblast, we have a look for Stelmakivka here, and we can see that Suryak's only update today is saying that there was a Russian movement here. So this Kolomyshkaka, I don't know, however that's going to be pronounced, in just this area here. So let's actually have a look, see if we can line this up, see where this paddock goes. That just in here, this road runs and bends down this paddock. That there was a close-up of territory in here that Russia had made some gain. Russian army new advances east of Stelmakivka. So in this area right here, somewhere that we haven't seen any movement on this map, but haven't seen any movement for a while either. Now, I just need to go back up north, as I have forgotten something, that this movement is further confirmed by another Ukrainian source, being Noel reports of a close-up of territory in here. What I will say is have a look at how much different these two maps are. So this Kotlarivka in here, that if we look at where this road then bends, this is bend in the road, and this road running through here. So it isn't showing this ballooning out to the west from Kislivka itself, because we can see this tree line that is there. So this should maybe be more like this, but it is showing far more to the south. So these two maps, both Ukrainian maps, aren't really lining up. Now, that is all the movements we actually have on the map today, although Noah reports, we know he took a week or so off, has updated his map to show down in Krinky here. And always interesting that this isn't shown as blue. We know Ukraine has expanded control here and also has soldiers across here, so we don't know why this isn't blue on this map, but has shown this movement across here and expanding control, just updating what exactly his map is showing from wherever he takes his sources. Now, what I will say is the rest of this video from here is going to be fairly heavily wordy, but I believe very, very important. Now, we're going to talk about Macron and China. I believe, and I think many will agree, many will disagree, that's fine, And that's the whole point of being open media like this is, and you can comment, and I'll never turn off the comments except when I forgot to leave them on once. You could disagree, and I've obviously changed in my reporting and beliefs throughout many different things. But I believe that China could very well be the fulcrum in this conflict. And they have become, over the past, say, decade, and especially from this war and, Russia using a lot of assets, far more of a military threat than Russia. Not only military power, but economic as well, and further reach out, as well as population. Now, speaking of Russian power, we have to look back at the Soviet Union, and many scholars actually say that the Soviet Union always had more of an ideological threat to the West than it did militarily. And to this day, still 30 years on from the collapse of the Soviet Union, we do still see many students, young people and old, and I believe more and more, wearing communist symbolism, preaching Marxist, Leninist, or even Stalinist ideas. There's a bloody bar down the road from me, and if anyone lives in Port Adelaide here, in Semaphore, that currently has out the front a hammer and sickle painted on the wall, a pride flag, a Palestinian flag, and an Indigenous flag being flown. I'm not sure if everything lines up between different ideas there, but just regardless. But let's have a look at China. And we do know that China is massively growing, and especially in Navy. So this is being quoted everywhere, but we're going to go through the full thing. Full text of Xi Jinping's signed article on French media. Now, a lot of this is just about relations and everything else. So I've gone through and found what is actually relevant to what we are talking about here. This year marks 70th anniversary of 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. 7 decades ago, Chinese Premier Zhu Enlai put forth 5 principles for the first time. Mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. China has faithfully practiced the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence over the past 70 plus years since its founding. New China never provoked a war or occupied an inch of foreign land. Now, he says China is the only country among the major nuclear states that is committed to a no first use of nuclear weapons. Although if we go back to some of what Mao has said about the survival of China with nuclear weapons as well, there was definitely a threat underlined in that. And I just want to have a look and talk about nuclear weapons for a second. Now, I'm a fucking dork, so I bloody put sticky notes all through my books. But I just want to talk about 2 things from Kissinger's World Order about the use of nuclear weapons and proliferation of nuclear weapons. But saying, and this goes back to this, like the pyrrhic use of nuclear weapons is the juice sort of worth the squeeze? But the penalties of military conflict were considered less than the penalties of defeat. By contrast, the nuclear age based itself on a weapon whose use would impose costs out of proportion to any conceivable benefit. So the benefit of nuclear weapons will be far more costly than the tactical use. That's why we say nukes have no tactical advantage, but massive strategic advantage as well as diplomatic advantage. If Russia did not have nuclear weapons, there would be no second thought about deploying NATO soldiers into Ukraine or these weapons or anything else in there, at least in my belief. And this is where I'll say that nuclear weapons have saved far more lives than they have taken. Saying there's a classic nuclear dilemma. Even when nuclear weapons reduce the likelihood of war, they will gigantically magnify its ferocity were a war to occur. Now, that is, you can take as you wish. And I do say you should have a look at what Mao says about nuclear weapons and the population of China and India as well, and how that disaster would unfold, but maybe in their favour long term as well. It is worth noting that countries like China and other countries have had a far more long run than say somewhere like Australia and see an eternal sort of existence. Anyway, China understands the repercussions of the Ukraine crisis. Now, the reason I've underlined crisis here is a lot of people have picked up on that. The refusal to say war or aggression or Russian aggression on the people of Europe. Now, again, War was not declared. I will say war, but that is interesting to point out there, as China has really been tried to maintain a neutrality. China did not start the Ukraine crisis, nor is it a party to or a participant in it. And what we can say, and many have pointed this out to me in my Telegram, is saying, well, China have, given Russia weapons and whatever, and they're towing the same line as the West, saying, well, we're not a participant in the Ukraine war, therefore, and what I will say is the amount of support given by the West to Ukraine compared to China to Russia, it's not comparable. We know China has supplied a lot of dual-use items, so electrical components that can go into weapons, as well as ISR stuff, which we know is being weaponized, as well as Russia is buying a lot from China as well. So you can't really say that is then aid, if that makes sense. But we're not seeing Chinese tanks or Chinese fighter aircraft rock up on the front lines. And if that were to happen, the war has changed significantly, and I think then we'd have to have a real second consideration of what's going on. China has been playing a constructive role in striving for peaceful settlement of the crisis. I have made many appeals, among others, observing the purpose and the principles of the UN Charter, respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries. So, of course, it's what we hear a lot about for Ukraine was territorial integrity and sovereignty, and addressing the legitimate security concerns of all sides. Of course, Russia and Ukraine have legitimate security concerns. Now, whether you think they're legitimate or not it doesn't matter. It does the country, the people in that country, and the leadership see that as a legitimate security concern. Same as with us with the Monroe deal in America. I should say us, but in America, they would see a foreign power of a large power on their border as a legitimate security concern, even if others would not. So Russia has security concerns. So obviously Ukraine does. They got bloody invaded. But I've stressed that nuclear weapons must not be used and a nuclear war must not be fought. China has delivered to Ukraine many shipments of humanitarian aid and sent a special representative many times to mediate among other countries concerned. The longer the Ukraine crisis drags on, the greater harm it will do to Europe and the world. Now, this is not only, when people say Europe, you have to consider that the west of Russia is in Europe too. And the longer this goes on, the more harm is being done to Europe economies, the rest of the world, just the men fighting in this, regardless of the patch on their shoulder. And that in a global economy, this is having large effect the more this goes on. And of course, the risk of where war can escalate or de-escalate from this, as well as, and I do believe wherever this war ends, it will really challenge security and economic facilities that we have at the moment around the world. China hopes that peace and stability will return to Europe at an early date. We stand ready to work with France and the whole international community to find a reasonable way out of the crisis. So, of course, China want to find and negotiate some solution then to what is happening. But as we know, a negotiation at this point in time would mean that there is a territorial shift. And then if Ukraine was to agree to, if Ukraine had a territorial shift and they didn't say that that is a legitimate border, things like NATO and the EU then come into question of the joining of that and further down the line actions. But we will see. And however this war ends, we know regardless of where the front line goes, that it has to end at some point. And, I guess it could go on for decades, but there will be an end at some point, and there will still have to be some diplomatic actions there, and China will be heavily, heavily involved in this. Now, let's have a look over this. Now, this is from RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, which is the oldest of the United Kingdom's think tanks, and leading defence think tank. Now, this is going to be long. I apologise for it, but if you're here, well, stick with me because I believe this is very, very important. Now, these aren't going to line up fantastically for some reason. Number 8 is not sitting there with me. I must have an extra space in here. Let's have a look at that. There we go. Fixed my issue. So let's talk about this. And what we're going to look at is prolonged war, attrition, mobilisation, and have a look and see how we can apply what is happening here to this war. So Number one from Russia. If the West is serious about the possibility of a great power conflict, it needs to take a hard look at its capacity to wage a protracted war and to pursue a strategy focused on attrition rather than maneuver. Attritional wars require the art of war and are fought with force-centric approach. Unlike wars of maneuver, which are terrain-focused, they are rooted in massive industrial capacity to enable the replacement of losses, geographical depth to absorb a series of defeats, technological conditions that prevent rapid ground movement. In attritional wars, military operations are shaped by a state's ability to replace losses and generate new formations, even when there is a series of defeats that take place, but not tactical and operational maneuvers. The side that accepts the attritional nature of war and focuses on destroying enemy forces rather than gaining territory is most likely to win. And we have seen Ukraine and Russia both implement to a degree this strategy, but I believe both Ukraine and Russia have at points failed on this strategy with the launch of the 2023 counteroffensive, which I think could be a fulcrum for the entirety of the war. What was probably launched early, needing some PR win, but was focused on that maneuver war in then a protracted attritional war of time. And we saw then the failure of this. Now, he says here, the West is not prepared for this kind of war. To most Western experts, attritional strategy is counterintuitive. Now, what I will say about this top part here is this is what many people are saying. Ukraine should have built up massive defense early, should have mobilized everyone early and focused on attritional war rather than regain of territory. Historically, the West preferred the short winner takes all clash of professional armies. We see in recent war games of 1 month of fighting. The possibility that the war would go on never entered the discussion. So leading that it's going to be quick, not years and years. War of attrition are treated as exemptions, something to be avoided at all costs and generally products of leaders' ineptitude. Unfortunately, wars between near-peer powers are likely to be attritional, thanks to a large pool of resources available to replace initial losses. And we have seen Russia be able to do these large losses in the beginning of that maneuver, and then we see the replacement of this. The attritional nature of combat, including the erosion of professionalism due to casualties, levels the battlefield, no matter which army started with better trained forces. This is very important. We've seen many senior people in the Australian military point at this, that the original high-trained military, they'll be there for the shock of the first wave if we step into something large. Then that will be attrited down, that will be eroded, and those more professionals will then be to train mobilized reserve soldiers from there. But there will be a leveling of the battlefield. And we see this at the moment with a lot of mobilized guys who were not in the military before this war now fighting. As the conflict drags on, the war is won by economies, not armies. So what we have here is two large economies. We can have Ukraine with the West supporting, but as well, that support can be cut away or can lift and drop. You have peaks and troughs of support. Russia has their economy, but it is then with much less allies than Ukraine. But because it is all domestic and it is all part of one element, that doesn't have the same peaks and troughs. And then, of course, with domestically produced equipment. But states that grasp this fights to war via attritional strategy aimed at exhausting enemies' resources while preserving their own are more likely to win. So exhausting your enemy and keeping your own, more likely to win. The fastest way to lose a war of attrition is to focus on maneuver, expending valuable resources on near-term territorial objectives. So trying to outmaneuver your enemy to get short-term objectives, territorial wins, PR victories, but not focused on then attriting your adversary down. We've seen both Russia and Ukraine fall into this trap. We haven't seen since Bakhmut Avdiivka massive movements from Russia either, and since the 2023 Ukrainian offensive, we haven't seen any large movements there. So it has been a while now, almost a year since that. The economic discussion. The wars of attrition are won by economies enabling mass mobilization of militaries via their industrial sectors. Armies expand rapidly during such a conflict, requiring massive quantities of armored vehicles, drones, electronic products, and other combat equipment. Because high-end weaponry weaponry is very complex to manufacture and consumes vast resources, a high-low mixture of forces and weapons is imperative in order to win. Now, this is something that I think the Soviets and the Russians have done well, is massive amounts of worse equipment rather than just striving for the best of the best of the best. Would you, in a ground war, 1,000 of these tanks or 50 better ones? And we'll go into the problems on this. And I think that the West have much too great of a focus on, as I've put in here, research and development. What, of course, in a capitalist system goes into shareholder price and construction and all of this. Of course, that has, and I'm not saying that then these weapons aren't good, but look at the weapons that have made such a huge difference recently on the front line. Basic things like FABs, landmines, old RPGs, clusters being strapped onto a drone rather than these systems. And these new systems, whether we're talking Bayraktar drones, javelins, ATACMS, the GPS-guided artillery systems, seem to be relevant for 6 to 8 weeks before counters are built for this. And high weapons have exceptional performance, but are difficult to manufacture. So as we said, if these systems get a counter in them, then you've got a lot less, more expensive equipment than you could have just had of dumb bombs or dumb shells, especially when needed to arm a rapidly mobilizing army. And we've seen this is where the West is failing on the Ukraine front, is just getting them the amount of stuff. High-end weapons require high-end troops, more training time, and significantly harder to run. So if you put an Abrams up against a T-72, it will beat it every day of the bloody week. But you need much more trained guys inside of that. It's much more expensive to run, and therefore you're going to have far less. So maybe that's not the best example, but as well. It is easier and faster to produce large numbers of cheap weapons and munitions, especially if their subcomponents are interchangeable with civilian goods, ensuring mass quantity without the expansion of production lines. New recruits also absorb simpler weapons faster, allowing rapid generation of new formations or the reconstitution of existing ones. And I think we've been, with so many weapons, focused too much on technology rather than just amount. And I've said before, the West is lucky we found out this problem in a localized war between Ukraine and Russia, rather than if we stepped into a full-on war and went, we're out of shells in 2 weeks. Fourth generation. Industrial output exists so it can be channeled into replacing losses and generating new formations. This requires appropriate doctrine and command and control structures. There are 2 main methods: the NATO, most Western armies, and old Soviet model, with most states somewhere in between. But NATO armies, highly professional, backed by strong non-commissioned NCO corps. The armies work on the back of NCOs who will be in charge, say, of 8, maybe 20 guys, with extensive peacetime military education and experience. So full-time professional soldiers getting paid professional wages. That's what they do for a job. To stress individual initiative, delegating a great deal of leeway to junior officers and NCOs, NATO formations enjoy tremendous agility and flexibility to exploit opportunities on a dynamic battlefield. And this is why this system works far better in a war like, say, Afghanistan or Iraq. In a traditional war, this method has a downside. The officers and NCO required to execute this doctrine require extensive training. So you have full-time guys, it's expensive. A US NCO takes years to develop. And I've said this before from my experience as both a soldier and NCO, that this takes a bloody long time. I did over 6 years in the military, and I reckon I got really competent at maybe 2 or 3 in a very professional army. And this is where I've put here this NATO standard that the Ukrainian Eastern Commander was saying about 1 month of training for NATO. You're not getting there at this. Squad leader generally has 3 years in service, depending, that's probably minimum. Platoon sergeant has at least 7, absolute minimum. In an attritional war characterized by heavy casualties, there simply isn't time to replace lost NCOs or generate them for new units. The idea that civilians can be given a 3-month training course, sergeants, chevrons, and expected to perform at the same manner of a 7-year veteran is a recipe for disaster. So this is where you have this problem of build-up professionalism when you're relying on those weapons we spoke about before, that you need a high amount of training to do mobility, mechanized warfare, say, or operate those highly complex pieces of equipment. It's harder to replace. The Soviet Union built its army for large-scale conflict with NATO. It was intended to be able to rapidly expand by calling up mass reserves. Every man in the Soviet Union went under 2 years of training, blah, blah, blah. The constant turnover of enlisted personnel precluded the creation of Western-style NCO corps, but generated a massive pool of semi-trained reserves in time of war. The absence of reliable NCOs created an officer-centric command model, less flexible than NATO's, but more adaptable to large-scale expansion required by attritional warfare. And this is what we can see, especially in the early days of Russia, was no real NCO corps. You had one officer to like 100 guys, and things really went to shit. But that can, of course, expand much faster. They're like looking here for attritional warfare. So these are all things, of course, there's pros and cons and everything, but things we need to look at and things we need to study when we're seeing an attritional war, a prolonged war now of 2.5 years go on. The most effective model is a mix of the two, in which a state maintains a medium-sized professional army together with a mass of draftees available for mobilisation. And I think one of the big things that we're going to have problems with, say in Australia, we've got a low population and low enlisted reserve numbers regardless, but mobilisation draftees is going to be incredibly difficult. And especially I think the biggest factor in this could be with the diversity of the country as well. This leads to a high-low mixture. Professional pre-war forces from a high in this army become fire brigades, so your better guys, moving from sector to sector in battle to stabilise the situation and conduct decisive attacks. So your better guys move around. Low-end formations hold the line and gain experience slowly, increasing their quality until they gain the capability to conduct offensive operations. Victory is attained by creating the highest low-end formations possible. There's many of examples of this down the line as well. You can have these SF elements, but if you don't have that low end or you don't have vice versa, you run into problems. Forging new units into combat-capable soldiers instead of civilian mobs is done through training and combat experience. New formation should train for at least 6 months. It's advisable to disband several pre-war high-end formations to spread professional soldiers among newly created low-end formations in order to raise initial quality. This is what the Green Berets in America absolutely specialize in, is going in with local forces and lifting up that low end. MRTF did it in Afghanistan as well. Of course, very different wars. But in this war, we see Wagner, when they were disbanded, going into Belarus and lifting that low end, as well as Wagner working with, so the professional arm of Wagner, you got to remember there's multiple arms, the professional arm of Wagner working one guy to 8 or one guy to 10 or whatever it was with the Russian paratrooper VDV to lift up that as well. And of course, this is what we are seeing to a degree in Ukraine, but I think could be done significantly more with the amount of Western troops outside of Ukraine that could conduct training as well. That these operations of training Ukrainian soldiers, it could be much, much larger. If we're really serious about training soldiers, it could be much, much larger, and will need to be once Ukraine actually announce the amount of guys they want to then mobilise. But one thing I will say in this is we're speaking about mobilisation now 2.5 years in, and I believe that Ukraine, look, you're fighting Russia. The war is going to be against Russia. We've seen Russia's sacrifice they're willing to make in war before, of attrition, of how many men they're willing to lose, or Soviets as well, that you don't think early in the war that you're fighting Russia, we're going to need men. Let's mobilise everyone with 2 bloody legs and see training. And now we run into this issue where we've had that, we're having manpower issues and still haven't had that, the new mobilisation effort. There's going to be a massive lull of at least a month, and this is saying more like 6th, that, you know, you could have had a lot more guys, and the West could have facilitated a shitload more training, like way more. Anyway, the military dimension. Military operations in attritional conflict are very distinct from those in a war of maneuver. Instead of a decisive battle achieved through rapid maneuver, attritional war focused on destroying enemy forces and their ability to regenerate combat power while preserving one's own. In this context, a successful strategy, except that the war will last at least 2 years and be broken into 2 distinct phases. So instead of trying to take Bakhmut and maneuver out of that, grind down forces, instead of trying in the Ukrainian offensive, heading out from Orikhiv to get Robotny to try and outmaneuver Russia's defensive lines to get down into Crimea, that grinding away. The first phase ranges from an initiation of hostilities to the point where sufficient combat power has been mobilized to allow decisive action. So you have the initial hostilities, and then let's mobilize enough combat power, soldiers, tanks, all of this to then have decisive action at the front. It will see little positional shifting on the ground, focusing on favorable exchange of losses and building up combat power in the rear. So building that behind the line before you actually see any movement. And this is where we see people go, oh, they're losing too quickly, they're winning too quickly, losing too slowly or winning too quickly, regardless of which way you see. Maybe we're in this. We're seeing little positional shift. The dominant form of combat is fires, so say artillery, rather than maneuver, complemented by extensive fortifications and camouflage. And this is something we have seen in Russia. They have artillery 10-1 currently, and massive fortifications, and many in Ukraine, including officials, have criticized the Zelensky government for the lack of fortifications built up, and now we're seeing them at 2+ years into the war getting built, as well as mobilization. The second phase can commence after one side has met the following conditions. Number 1, newly mobilized forces have completed their training and gained sufficient experience to make them combat effective formations. So saying at least 6 months. The enemy's strategic reserve is exhausted, leaving it unable to reinforce the threatened sector. And this is where I see mainly of where we've seen the failure of the 2023 then offensive was this. We didn't have new mobilized forces in enough. Russia was not, their reserve was not exhausted, and fires and reconnaissance superiority were definitely not achieved. They didn't, absolutely not. And this is failures for Russia's initial offensive as well. And the enemy's industrial sector is degraded to the point where it's unable to replace battlefield losses. In the case of fighting against a coalition of countries, their industrial resources must be exhausted or at least accounted for. This is going to affect Russia, of course, industrial-wise. Hasn't affected as much as we may have thought, but Ukraine's industrial sector is the West industrial sector, which can pump out basically forever. But the politics of that the industrial sector allocated towards defending Ukraine, the politics will give out first before the money or the equipment going in, at least in my opinion. Now, number 6 here, we're getting through it. The modern war. Modern battlefields are integrated systems, which includes various types of EW, so multi-layered bits. The artillery has become most dangerous thanks to increased ranges and advanced targeting, stretching the depth of the battlefield. So the amount of range you have, that grey zone has extended massively in practice. This means it is easier to mass fires than forces. You can't just have guys a few Ks behind the line massing that it's much more difficult because you can hit them. Deep maneuver, which requires a massive combat powers, is no longer possible because any massed force will be destroyed by indirect fires. And this is what I've said about my doubts about North Group is Ukraine's saying 35 to 70,000 guys. Where are they massed? If this is legit up in Belgorod, Kursk, I'm not seeing fires hit them because Ukraine would be bloody hitting them. And this is what we're seeing behind the line both ways and having problems with massive maneuver war. You just can't get the guys that many in an area to then move through. So because of this, shallow attacks across along the entire, because of this, shallow attacks along the forward line of troops are most likely to be successful at an acceptable cost ratio. Attempts at deep penetration will be exposed to massed fires at the moment they exit the protection of the defensive bubble. So mass push in, you exit that bubble, then you'll start getting hit and it will then stop. So you see attacks everywhere. We saw Ukraine do that on the offensive, the 23 offensive and the 24 Russian offensive. We are seeing shallow attacks along the then entire front line. Implications for combat operations: deep fires further than 100 to 150 kilometers, so 60 to 100 miles. The average range of tactical rockets, then this is where we're seeing Ukraine has had a massive, Russia has had a massive benefit on Ukraine, is Ukraine for a long time wasn't given these rockets and still is in far less than Russia has. Target enemies' ability to generate combat power. This includes production facilities, munition dumps, repair depots, and energy and transportation infrastructure. And this is what I've spoken about, the unfairity of this war with Ukraine not being supplied with those systems or the amount of them, and even more so not being allowed with those same systems to be strike in Russia, therefore can't really do this part of it. And this is why we're seeing Russia with different systems firing in. as well as all aspects of attritional war, such strikes will take significant time to have an effect, with timelines running into years. So you hit an ammo depot or an ammo dump, you don't see that bang on the front line, no ammo. Can take a lot longer and a lot of time coming in. And strikes against, say, economic bits and pieces, say oil refineries in Russia and whatever, short-term lift the cost with supply and demand of oil, lift the cost of oil, and actually Russia will then have more cash reserve, but it will take a long time for that to then set in. Successful attritional war focuses on the preservation of one's own combat power. This usually translates into a relatively static front, which is what we're seeing, interrupted by local attacks to improve position. So this just positional movement we've seen now for a year. Using artillery for most of the fighting, fortifications and concealment of all forces, including logistics, is a key to minimizing losses. Fortifications, defensive, build up, artillery. The long time required to construct fortifications prevents significant ground movement. Defensive operations buy time to develop low-end combat formations, allowing newly mobilized troops to gain combat experience without suffering heavy losses in large-scale attacks. This is where I think for Russia's war in Ukraine, that Wagner may have actually saved Russia to a degree with coming in. They were doing the brunt of the fighting in Bakhmut, while the rest was building then massive defensive works in the south and east and focusing on then this development of low combat formations, while the main brunt was taken by a PMC that included guys that were thrown in jail or criminals or people from outside of Russia coming in as well. It was mercenaries, not the Russian forces. So again, allowing newly mobilized to gain combat experience. I think that we underestimate that. Early stages of attritional war, from initiation of hostilities to the point where mobilized resources are available in large numbers, are ready for combat operations. So then they're ready. That this period lasts a year and a half to 2 years. So we have seen that the war range of initiation of hostilities to the point where you're mobilizing enough can take 2 years. So initial hostilities, Russia enters Ukraine initial and defensive, blah, 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 to then mobilize the amount of equipment, men, everything could take 2 years. And I think this is the Russian offensive we're seeing now is what has become of that. Maybe we will see Ukraine have that, but they're having manpower issues, and if we're saying it's going to be 2 years, this is the problem with the West drip feeding in equipment. Well, does that just reset all the time that you haven't had? Should have 2 years ago when this happened go, hey, we're fighting Russia, they're going to have 1 million men, we need to mobilize every single man we can with 2 bloody legs and give them some form of training. Maybe not call them up, put them on the front line yet, but some bloody form. Instead, this could take more time now as well. During this period, major offensive operations should be avoided. There we go. If large attacks are successful, they'll result in significant casualties, often for meaningless territorial gains. So Pyrrhic gains, that what you've got is not worth what you have lost. And I believe there are many examples of this. No better example, I think, than the 23 offensive, that due to not having air cover, pushing on many axes, not having the amount of resources or support ready, actually put Ukraine far further back in their goals in this war than if they sat in defense, treated down Russia like we've seen over the last, say, now 8 or 9 months, rather than launching maybe that preemptive, non-ready attack. And I think more and more people are swinging onto saying that also. The goal is to force the enemy to expend vital material and strategic reserves on strategically meaningless operations. So force them in, wear them out, and not getting them, even if that means you're stepping back and back. And many will say Ukraine's doing this currently, although I don't know if we can say it's vital and meaningless operations in the areas it's going. When the second phase begins, the offensive should be launched across a broad front, seeking to overwhelm the enemy at multiple points using shallow attacks. Exactly what we're seeing, talking about that bubble of protective systems which are friendly to you, while stretching depleted enemy reserve until the front lines collapse. There is a cascading effect in which crisis in one sector forces defenders to shift reserve from another sector, only to generate a crisis there in return. As forces start falling back and leaving prepared fortifications, morale plummets. We're seeing all of this, I believe, at the moment. So we're seeing shallow movements on multiple
fronts or shallow attacks on multiple fronts, from everywhere down in Robotny, Krasnohivka, Novomylivka, Avdivka, Bakhmut, and then up in Kislivka. And this, I think, is if we see the North Group, we'll be crossing to Sumy and move guys around. Exactly what we saw when Ukraine had its offensive last year, was they're focusing down here and then had forces actually cross into Belgrade and Kursk as well, moving Russian forces around and reinforcements around, shifting to a second sector, as they say, to generate a crisis there. And then, as forces are falling back, prepared fortifications and morale plummets. We've seen this in Avdivka, with the obvious question, so being asked by soldiers, if we can't hold the mega fortress, how can we hold these new trenches? Retreat then turns into rout. Only then should offensive extend towards objectives deeper in the rear. So I think this is what was trying to be hoped down here towards Tokmak, and these offensive works, can we get this up? That if they push through to here, if we can't hold this massive Surovikin line, what else is going to hold further and further down? But I think we've seen this as well play out in Avdivka, that these fortifications, Badachi, Semenivka, then the second lines as well are under threat of this further back slide. And then what we're seeing, if you listen to TikToks, you see Ukrainian guys talking online about mobilization, is, well, what are we going to do? Further mobilization, look at that front line, and it's affecting morale and guys volunteering for service. Attritional strategy centered on defense is counterintuitive of most Western military officers. Western military thought views the offensive as the only means of achieving decisive strategic goal of forcing the enemy to come to the negotiating table on unfavorable terms, so defeat and bring them there. The strategic patience required to set the conditions for an offensive runs against their combat experience acquired in overseas counterinsurgency operations. So, offensive, getting areas, decisive goal, bring you to the table rather than attriting down. And this is what I think the West had a lot of problems with. A lot of experience in counterinsurgency operations and not in classic large war operations. Where I say that, yes, say, not me, but say my training, I might have more slick drills on a range than some Ukrainian soldier. It may be better NCO training, but I have zero classic war experience like this. And I think there is this Western savior of some of this training that and you're like, how much, one Ukrainian or Russian soldier on this front line here has more experience than the entirety of Australian American brigades in conventional warfare, drone warfare. Experience really matters. We need to listen to that both ways. The military conduct of war is driven by overall political strategic objectives, military realities, which is what we need to look at. We need to look at military realities and economic limitations. Combat operations are shallow and focus on destroying enemy resources, not on gaining terrain. So destroy the enemy rather than get territory. Propaganda is used to support military operations, not the other way around. So not launch from propaganda, but is to support the military. With patience and careful planning, a war can be won. So let's have a look. We'll actually talk about this first part. The conduct of attritional wars is vastly different from wars of maneuver. They last longer. They end up testing a country's industrial capacity. Victory is assured by careful planning, industrial-based development, and development of mobilization infrastructure in times of peace. So now doing that, which many countries, the UK, Australia, have talked about mobilisation, how that may work in countries while in peacetime. Even more careful management of resources in wartime. They thought that any major power would back down in case of initial military defeat is wishful thinking at best. So if you think that initial defeat, which you could point out of Russia, that then it will just back down, this is what we saw. Russia got hounded those first months of the war, the 100,000+ guys that entered into the country. But saying that then it's over from there, you can't then have that. That's wishful thinking, as they say. Cavalier attitude towards future conflicts will be short and decisive, which, well, if this has shown us anything, it's not going to be that. If the West is serious about a possible great power conflict, it needs to take a hard look at its industrial capacity, mobilisation doctrine, and means of waging a protracted war, rather than conducting war games covering a single month of conflict and hoping that the war ends afterwards. As the Iraq War taught us, hope is not a method. So exactly what this war has shown us. Industrial capacity of just building dumb equipment is not there currently. It is being built up, but could take many, many years to do. And it's going to be incredibly expensive and is still, I believe, probably focused too much on technological advancement rather than just sheer equipment and mobilisation. How do we mobilise? And also, what would be the success of mobilisation for long-term war? And at one point, we're mobilisation might have worked when the boys were coming off farms to go and fight and were very passionate about the country and this and that. I just don't believe we have that anymore. And we're seeing that with the unpopularity of mobilisation and what is being said at the moment. Legends, 50-something minutes. Look after yourselves. Have a fantastic day. If you get to this point, you're a bloody legend. You're better than me. Look after yourselves. I'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.